Hi everyone, my name is Alexandra, and in this video we'll be going through a practice question on research study designs. So the question is, a research group is studying whether or not living close to the highway increases risk of children developing asthma. They identify 500 children from ages 2 to 8 living in housing located within 1,000 feet of a major highway, and 500 children from ages 2 to 8 living in housing located at least 1 mile from a major highway. 5 years later, the researchers check the children's clinical records and determine how many in each group have been diagnosed with asthma. What kind of study design best describes this study? A. Case control study. B. Cross-sectional study. C. Prospective cohort study. D. Randomized clinical trial. E. Case series. F. Retrospective cohort study. G. Crossover study. Or H. Ecological study. So take some time to think about this question. I'll pause here for about 15 seconds, and you can pause the video if you need more time. Alright, so the answer here is prospective cohort study. Let's talk through how we got to that answer. So the first thing I like to do when approaching these questions is determine if the study is observational or experimental. You'll recall that these are the two major broad categories of research design. And I think a really useful way to do that is to first identify the independent variable that the researchers are hypothesizing is the cause of some outcome, and the dependent variable, which is the outcome that is being measured. So let's identify the hypothesis of the study, since that's going to include both our independent and dependent variable. So in the first sentence, we find out that this research group is studying whether or not living close to the highway increases the risk of children developing asthma. So here we see that the exposure that they are studying is living close to the highway. And the outcome that they're studying is whether or not the children develop asthma. So our independent variable or our exposure is proximity to highway, and our dependent variable or our outcome is developing asthma. So let's figure out if this study is observational or experimental. Remember that in an observational study, researchers are simply observing what is happening in a population without directly manipulating any variables, whereas in the experimental study, researchers directly manipulate the independent variable to assess what happens to the dependent variable. So in an experimental study, you're going to be looking for language like, the researchers assign these participants to this treatment group. And remember also that for experimental studies involving humans, the exposure must be hypothesized to be helpful. So we're going to be studying something like a treatment that decreases the risk of a bad event happening to a person. Looking at our study, we don't see anything in this question stem describing the researchers changing the proximity of the children to the highway. And also our exposure, proximity to the highway, is hypothesized to be harmful or to increase the risk of children developing asthma. So all of that suggests that we are looking at an observational study. So looking at our list of answer options here, which ones can we cross out based on figuring that out? So we know that experimental studies include randomized clinical trials and crossover studies. In randomized clinical trials, participants receive a treatment and are compared against participants receiving either a placebo or a different treatment. And in crossover studies, every single participant receives both treatments being compared. So we can cross off randomized clinical trial and crossover study off of our list because we know that the study in this question is not an experimental study. Okay, so now we know our study is an observational study, and how do we narrow that down to the final answer choice? Next, I like to think about what is the time course of the study. Remember that in some observational studies, data on both the exposure and the outcome are collected simultaneously. And other studies collect data on exposure and outcome at different points in time in order to establish a temporal relationship between the hypothesized cause and the hypothesized effect. Studies where exposure and outcome data are measured simultaneously include case reports and case series, where participants with the outcome of interest are followed over time. And remember, this is usually a really small number of individuals, so either one person for a case report or multiple people for a case series. This also includes cross-sectional studies, which provide a snapshot in time of the number of people who have the exposure and or the outcome of interest, and ecological studies, where average levels of exposure and outcome are measured across entire populations. All right, so let's look through our study and see if the researchers are measuring proximity to highway and developing asthma simultaneously, or if they're measuring it at different time points. So the first thing our researchers do is they identify children that are living near the highway and children that aren't living near the highway. So that's measuring our exposure at a certain point in time. And now we come across this statement of 5 years later, the researchers assess the clinical records and determine who is diagnosed with asthma. So now 5 years later, we're assessing the outcome. So based on the study description, the researchers are assessing exposure and outcome not simultaneously, but at different time points. So based on that, we know that we're going to fall into a longitudinal observational study, and we can cross off case series, cross-sectional study, and ecological study off of our answer choice list. So now we're left with case control study, prospective cohort study, and retrospective cohort study, which are all longitudinal observational studies. So now we want to figure out if this is a case control study or a cohort study, and we can do that by looking at how the participants are recruited into the study. In case control studies, participants are recruited based on the outcome of interest, and then their exposure history in the past is assessed. In cohort studies, participants are recruited based on the exposure of interest. So let's identify how our participants are being recruited into the study. At the beginning of the study, the researchers are identifying children that live close to the highway, and they're identifying children that live far away from the highway. So based on this statement, we know that the researchers are recruiting participants based on their exposure history. And then we see that later they go on to measure the outcome. So this rules out a case control study design, because in a case control study design, the participants would be recruited based on their asthma diagnosis, and then their proximity to the highway would be assessed. So we can cross off answer choice A, which leaves us with just figuring out if this is a prospective or a retrospective cohort study. So we'll draw our little timeline here, and we'll mark this as the point where the researchers begin the study. So in a prospective cohort study, the researchers begin the study before the participants have developed the outcome of interest. So they recruit participants based on exposure history at the beginning of the study, and then after a period of time, they assess who has developed the outcome and who has not. In a retrospective cohort study, participants that were known to have an exposure at some point in the past are recruited, and then their outcome history, either in the more recent past or in present day, is assessed. So let's figure out how this timeline applies to the study being described in this question. Remember that we as the researchers are right here in the present when the study begins. So when this study begins, the researchers are identifying 500 children who are currently at this moment living in housing either close or far from a highway. So currently at this moment, these children have this exposure. And then 5 years later, so now we're looking into the future on this timeline, we are assessing their outcome. So that 5 years later part is really key to figuring out if this is a prospective or a retrospective study, because in a retrospective study, participants are not followed out into the future. Everything in a retrospective study is happening in the past or in present day. So we can cross off retrospective study, and now we have our answer that this is a prospective cohort study. So let's go through and summarize our thought process for this question. The first thing we did was we figured out that this study was an observational study because the independent variable is not being directly manipulated by the researchers, and because the exposure is hypothesized to be harmful. Then we figured out that this was a longitudinal study based on the fact that the exposure and outcome are being measured at different time points. Then we figured out that this was a cohort study because the participants were being recruited based on their exposure history, so based on whether or not they live close to the highway, and not their outcome history. And then we determined that this was a prospective cohort study because the participants were being followed into the future instead of having both their exposure history and their outcome occur in the past. So at this point, we've talked through a lot of different characteristics of different research study designs and how to compare and contrast them. As an additional exercise, pause the video here and take a moment to think through how you would redesign this research study in order to make the correct answer one of the other answer choices. So I'll erase this so you can see it a little better. And try to think through how would you rewrite this question in order to make the correct answer case control study, cross-sectional study, randomized clinical trial, and so forth. And we'll go through the answers on the next slide. All right, so to make this a case control study, remember that we'll need to select our participants based on their outcome and not based on their exposure. So we would select 500 children with asthma, so that's our outcome or our dependent variable, and 500 without, and then assess their exposure history to growing up near the highway. To make this a cross-sectional study, we need to assess both the exposure and the outcome at the same exact time. So we could take a population of 1,000 children and see if they're currently diagnosed with asthma and see if they live near the highway or not. So really all we need to do is we need to cross out this 5 years later component. To make this a randomized clinical trial, we need to manipulate the independent variables. So we would need to select a group of children and make half of them live near the highway and make half of them live far away from the highway, and then assess whether or not they're diagnosed with asthma in 5 years. Of course, this is unethical, and we can't do that. To make this a case series, we would select a small group of children, so let's say 10 children, who have our outcome of interest, and we would write a detailed report about their environments. And from this, we might develop a hypothesis about certain exposures. So for example, we might see that a lot of children who are diagnosed with asthma seem to live near the highway, and from there we could run these other more rigorous studies. To make this a retrospective cohort study, we would still select participants based on their exposure history. So we could select 500 children who, in the past, lived near the highway as children, and 500 who did not. And then we would assess their asthma diagnosis. So we would assess the outcome. And notice that in this situation, everything is happening either in the past or present, and nothing is happening in the future, unlike in the study initially described in the question stem. A crossover study isn't really a feasible research design for this question because two treatments aren't being compared, and it would be really hard to figure out what the washout period needs to be for living close to the highway versus not living close to the highway. For an ecological study, we need to look at population level data and not individual level data. So instead of recruiting specific participants, we would simply look at the average proximity of housing to the highway and the rates of overall asthma diagnosis in an entire city. And then we could compare, say, two different cities and see if the city where housing is on average closer to the highway also has children who are more often diagnosed with asthma. And this brings us to the end of our chapter on research study designs.